I cannot accept the way you weaseled out of my question about what are you living for and what's the evidence that what you are living for is true.
And the graves open, and the holy ones of Jerusalem exit their graves and walk around the city of Jerusalem, appearing to many. Do you think that happened?
You cannot be agnostic when it comes to, is human life valuable? Is there a meaning to life? What's the ethical system I'm going to embrace? And when I sit at a funeral, is there any hope of seeing this person again one day, or is there not?
The most extraordinary event in human history was recorded in the Gospel of Matthew.
I don't think that's fair. You are far too articulate. You are far too deep a thinker to convince me that there's not something that's powerfully motivating you. You're living for something, for someone, for some worldview, some philosophies, religion, whatever. Come on, sir. You are not just an accident. You didn't just arrive at where you are now by chance. You know that as well as I do.
I don't know that. You were just talking about adding something to the Quran. I have, I guess, two questions that I want to ask you, Cliff. The first is this. Do you agree with the scholarly consensus of biblical scholarship, that is, that both the long ending of the Gospel of Mark and also the story of the adulterous woman in John's Gospel were added later than the earliest manuscripts, were later interpolations of the text?
Due to the precise nature of the manuscript evidence from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, there is serious question whether the end of Mark chapter 16 was an addition or whether it was part of the original writing. The same is true for John chapter 7, the end of 7, and the first 11 verses of John 8. There is serious question due to the fact that those passages are not found in the earliest Greek manuscripts that we have, whether those additions or not. Now, Alex, please answer the question. What is more reasonable than the God of the New Testament? Who or what do you put your faith in that is based on more evidence of reliability?
We're getting to this point of reliability because I don't want to just change the subject here. You didn't answer my question.
Alex, you asked a lot of questions. Now, could you please?
Yeah, but you didn't answer my question. Do
Yes,
you believe that they were later additions or not?
I don't know, but there's solid evidence that those were possibly additions. I don't know.
Okay. In which case, because we have to follow the thread of the argument here, otherwise it's a useless endeavor. If we have good evidence to suggest that people were adding stories into the gospel manuscripts even after they were first published, do we not have good reason to therefore think that people could also add stories to these manuscripts before they were written? In other words, that there are all kinds of things that end up in the gospel manuscripts that did not actually happen and weren't in the earliest of traditions.
Historically, that would make zero sense because of the earliest church and how close the events themselves were reported through oral eyewitness testimony, not oral tradition. It was spread throughout the entire universal church and was being preached not just by pastors who were looking for nickels and noses. It was preached by the common people. And so to say that there were early additions is such a leap of faith. It's scary just because potentially there was later additions. I don't think that follows.
Maybe Jesus did, Alex. Maybe Jesus was just a cosmic hoax. It's possible.
I think Jesus existed.
It's possible. The question is not what is ultimately possible. The question is, what does the evidence point to as most reasonable, most reliable in light of the evidence that we do have?
That's right. Do you think that outside of the people that Jesus and the apostles and the prophets of the Old Testament rose from the dead themselves, do you think that Jesus is the only person who's ever risen from the dead?
No, Jesus raised people from the dead.
No, outside of the people that Jesus rose from the dead and the apostles and the Old Testament prophets rose from the dead.
It's totally possible that there is some type of near-death experience or some type
No, I mean like bodily resurrection of the dead.
I am not intelligent enough to follow all of the claims, but the resurrection of Christ, I think, is historically validated in a very intellectually satisfying manner.
So here's a question. In Matthew chapter 27, we're told that there's an earthquake, the second earthquake of Matthew, neither of which we have any other reports of, but there's an earthquake and the graves open and the holy ones of Jerusalem exit their graves and walk around the city of Jerusalem, appearing to many. Do you think that happened?
Yes, I do think that happened. Now, Alex, it's time for you to answer my question. What is the alternative to the biblical God, Jesus Christ, that you accept as more reliable? And secondly, what's the evidence that that alternative to Christ is really reliable?
I'm an agnostic. I don't submit to know what the ultimate answers to human existence are, but I don't think that the evidence for Christianity being the correct one is plausible.
So give me the more plausible one. That was my question, Alex. What's the more plausible one? that you have chosen to follow? Because obviously you're dressed a certain way. Obviously you have your hair on your face manicured very nicely. So obviously you have motives, you have ambitions. Okay, so you're living for something or someone. What is it, and what's the evidence that what you are living for is reliable?
I'm afraid I kind of just reject the grammar of the question. I don't have a systematized theology because I don't even believe in the existence of God. I'm an agnostic. Like I say, I don't know the answer to these questions. I don't know what my ultimate motivations are. I don't even have access to my own sort of deepest psychology. So I couldn't tell you why it is that I shaved my mustache and regrew a beard. I don't know, but I know that it's not because of a man who I don't even believe claimed to be God in the first place, allegedly dying on a cross and leaving some scanty evidence behind
I don't
him.
think that's fair. You are far too articulate. You are far too deep a thinker to convince me that there's not something that's powerfully motivating you. You're living for something, for someone, for some worldview, some philosophies, religion, whatever. Come on, sir. You are not just an accident. You didn't just arrive at where you are now by chance. You know that as well as I do.
I don't know that. I mean, that's to beg the question. That's precisely the kind of thing that we're trying to discuss here. I don't know how many times I can tell you I'm an agnostic. I don't know how we got here. I don't know how the universe began. I don't know if there's a God. What I do know is that the textual evidence for things like the resurrection in the New Testament is simply not enough to convince me. For example,
what is enough to convince you that whatever you're living for is true?
I don't know. But for example, the reason I brought up the raising of the dead in Matthew chapter 27 is because, look, this is an argument from silence, but some arguments from silence work. And if you'll allow me to finish this point, you agree that the most extraordinary event in human history was recorded in the Gospel of Matthew. That is that numerous people rose from the dead, walked around the city of Jerusalem, and were seen by many witnesses. That's what we're told. Interestingly, the text is a little unclear because it says that at the time of Jesus's death, the graves opened, and then they appeared to people after the resurrection, implying that there's this 3-day period where they're either laying around in empty graves or hidden somehow. It seems like a bit of a confused text. Now, again, one hypothesis is that this actually happened, and for some reason they were, I guess, like maybe still dead in their graves for 3 days and then they got up or something. And that this is, although, like I say, the most extraordinary event that's ever happened in the history of our species and seen by many people, recorded in the Gospel of Matthew in one passing sentence, but is not mentioned in Mark or Luke or John, is not mentioned in Josephus, is not mentioned in Acts, is not mentioned in any other historical source. People will say this is an argument from silence. Somebody said to me recently, oh, we don't have any written sources of the destruction of Pompeii either. That doesn't mean it didn't happen. Sure, but imagine that we had numerous sources writing about the city of Pompeii at the time that it was destroyed by a volcanic eruption that didn't mention the volcano. They were writing about Pompeii at the time it's supposed to have happened, and they don't mention the eruption. That would be incredibly strange and suspect and make me think that we couldn't trust our source. So one hypothesis is that this actually happened, and for some inexplicable reason, it is just complete radio silence on all of our historical sources. Or it didn't happen and was an invention of Matthew in order to do something like fulfill the prophecy of the apocalyptic Jesus, that soon there would be a general resurrection of the dead. Why is it that when Jesus dies, the graves open, but it's not until after the resurrection that they start appearing to people? Is it because Jesus is supposed to be the firstborn of the dead? Is he supposed to be the first one that's resurrected? I don't know. But like you, Cliff, I'm asking what is the most plausible historical explanation here? And I just don't think that this event happened in the way that you think it did. And if it did, it's a complete and utter mystery why these other sources do not even get a whisper of it.
Just on the question of
God, there is absolutely no problem with resurrection. If there's no supernatural God, then obviously resurrection doesn't happen. But Alex, I cannot accept the way you weaseled out of my question about what are you living for and what's the evidence that what you are living for is true. Agnosticism is an option when it comes to, do I prefer spaghetti or pasta? Do I prefer beans or broccoli? I'm agnostic, okay? But when it comes to the ethical decisions that you have to make every day, when it comes to, is human life valuable, and if so, why? When it comes to, is there a meaning and purpose to life, or is there not? And when it comes to, is there life after death or not? You have to go to funerals, Alex and Phil, so do I. People die. You're going to die, I'm going to die. And you have to ask the question, is there life after death or not? You can't just say, I'm agnostic, I don't know. You've got to figure out, is despair a logical conclusion, or is there some reason for hope? You cannot be agnostic when it comes to, is human life valuable? Is there a meaning to life? What's the ethical system I'm going to embrace? And when I sit at a funeral, is there any hope of seeing this person again one day, or is there not? You are forced to deal with those questions. And to sit back and say, I'm agnostic about whether I pay my taxes or not, I'm agnostic whether I'm going to support equal housing opportunity or not, is a cop-out. You can't live your life that way. It's impossible. That is the impossibility of agnosticism. And that's why, Alex, I don't think you've honestly answered my question.
So can I just
misunderstanding me, but
interrupt for a
I
second?
can try my best
I
here.
want to come in for a second.
I do want to give you a chance to respond, Alex, and I also know that I want to keep track and mention that, Phil, I know you were wanting to make a point, so I do want to give Alex a quick chance to give a pithy reply, and then we'll go over to you, Phil, before we go back over to Cliff and Stuart.
It'll take a moment, because I think we can try to wrap this business up. I don't know why Cliff seems to be under the impression that agnosticism is literally impossible, not just irrational, but impossible. But when it comes to ethical decision, for example, it's well known that amongst my followers that I'm an ethical emotivist. I'm not attached to that position particularly strongly, but it seems to make sense of the way that I interact with the world and the way that I see people doing ethics. I think that ethical propositions are expressions of emotion, and that's kind of the end of it. Now, I could be wrong about that. You might think that that has disastrous societal consequences, but to imply that it's impossible to adopt that position, to imply that it's impossible to say, I don't know if there is a God or not, I just think is unintelligible, because I do it. Lots of people do it. It's not just that you're claiming that it's irrational, but that it's impossible. You say I'm forced to make, I'm forced to, of course I have motivations for my actions. You know, when I do X or Y, especially when it's a so-called moral decision, of course I have a motivation, but as an ethical emotivist, I believe that I'm just expressing an emotional state. And that is perhaps a pessimistic conclusion, but that's not to say a false one.
I do want to give you a chance,